This is the Advanced Library Workshop, part of the EASE Workshop series, corresponding to the Biology 202 lab course. My name is Amy Jankowski, and I'm the Biology Librarian here at the University of New Mexico Libraries. In this session, we're going to talk a little bit about the relationship between the research process, scientific discovery, and scholarly primary research literature. We're also going to learn more about the parts of a primary research article, including what information is presented in each. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about strategies to effectively read a primary research article for comprehension. So to start, I'm here on the University Library homepage, library.unm.edu, and for most of this session, I'm going to be working off of a research guide created for the Biology 203 course. This guide is also accessible through the Learn platform in the EASE Workshops folder. But from the library website, we can find it using this Research Help tab. Then from Subjects, the Browse Subjects list, we can choose Biology. And then here it is, Biology 203. So here you can find, just on the home page of this guide, my contact information. If you have any additional questions following this session, you could contact me in any of these ways and also schedule an appointment directly with the Schedule Appointment button. It takes a little bit to load, but from here you can select the day and then pick a time. Okay. To start out, I want to talk a little bit about the scientific research process. Basically, in this session and in your course, Biology 203, you're going to talk a lot about primary research articles or original research articles. I want to give some context for why those are so important. To start, I want to think about why we do scientific research in the first place. There are a lot of reasons, but a lot of these come down to advancing scientific knowledge, curiosity, answering questions to prove or disprove hypotheses, and just to gain a better understanding of a topic or field. Clicking on the Scientific Research Process tab, I want to point out this infographic. I'm going to click the link below it to make it a little bit bigger. This is a visualization of how we as scientists do research. Research is based on the scientific method. This process mirrors the process of many lab reports in your science classes. So basically, we start over here making observations of the world around us. Following that, we conduct some background research and formulate questions about the things we observe. From those questions, we construct a hypothesis or hypotheses, which are basically predictions about how a question may play out. Then we develop these predictions that can actually be tested through experiments, which are tested, and we gather data. If the experiments don't go as planned for any reason, we can refine, alter, expand, or reject hypotheses and develop new ones and retest. After data is produced and gathered, we can analyze that data, develop theories and draw conclusions from the data, and then communicate results. And the primary way that scientists communicate the results of experiments is through primary research literature, through primary research articles or original articles. Those concepts mean the same thing, and that's generally a paper published in a journal that shows the different steps of this full research process. So after results are communicated, this isn't part of the infograph, but this is the production of new scientific information, whether that's new findings, new methods to conduct studies. And that information can have all kinds of effects, from policy changes, medical advances, and just a deeper understanding of different fields. So this is really the essence of how science is communicated. It can be helpful to think about primary research literature as the documented conversation of scientific scholarship. So science isn't conducted in a vacuum. Instead, science can be thought of as a gradual process that many people participate in. And the thing that can make it especially valuable is knowing about the other findings and other research that fellow scientists are producing. So this conversation doesn't happen in real time, but instead it's documented through primary research literature, where scientists cite existing studies and then lay the groundwork for future studies to be done, building on the research that they've conducted. Primary research literature can be thought of as a place to go to really understand the development of a topic by different individuals with different perspectives. Going back to the LibGuide, the research guide for Biology 203, there's some more information on this tab about the research process in terms of thinking about science as a conversation. And there's a video that you can watch in your own time if you want more information about that. Next, I want to talk a little bit about what primary research articles are. So I'm going to click About Primary Research on the left. So there's a lot of text on here, and I'm not going to read everything now, but you can definitely use this guide as a source to learn more on your own time. But basically, you could think of primary research articles as the documentation of that scientific process that I was talking about. So within these articles, you're going to be able to identify a structure that really mirrors that scientific process. And the standard structure that most primary research articles use is based on IMRD. I meaning introduction, M meaning methods, R meaning results, and D meaning discussion. I'll talk a little bit more about what each of those sections mean and what kind of information you'll find in them, but I just want to communicate the importance of these sections when you're trying to identify if an article you're looking at is a primary research article. Primary research articles are typically published in scientific journals or scholarly journals. You may also hear primary research articles referred to as original research articles, or more broadly as peer-reviewed articles or scholarly articles. The concept of a peer-reviewed or scholarly article is actually more broad than primary research articles. Those are just one type of scholarly or peer-reviewed article. You may understand the concept of a journal already, but as a review, basically a journal is like a scholarly or scientific magazine. It's something produced by professional scholars in that field, and the intended audience is professional scholars in that field. So it's really the primary place that scientists go to find information about new research being conducted in different topic areas. There are a lot of types of articles published in journals. A couple of those are peer-reviewed types, so the primary research articles. And then the other most common type of peer-reviewed article that you can find in a journal is a review article. So what that basically means is that it's an article held to those same standards of sound science, sound reasoning, but it's not conducting any new research, gathering new results and analyzing that. It doesn't show that full research process that a primary article does. Instead, it basically gives an overview of the different studies that have been conducted in a certain topic or certain subject area. So it gives you a good understanding of the research that's been done in that field in an objective way. Review articles can be great sources to find original articles or primary articles on a certain topic, and they can be a great place to go to really understand the full scope of research that's been conducted in a subject area. Meta-analysis articles may also be peer-reviewed, but those are basically articles analyzing existing data. So these articles aren't generating any new data that would be generated through an original experiment, like in a primary research article. So the way to make sure that you're not reading a meta-analysis article is to make sure that in the methods section of a paper, the authors are actually describing a new experiment that they conducted to generate new data. They're not reusing an existing data set generated through another study. Meta-analysis articles may follow that same IMRD structure, and even review articles can follow that structure sometimes. But you just want to make sure to really pay attention to the content in the methods and results section to make sure that a new experiment is being conducted, generating that new data. I just want to go and show you a couple examples which we can use to practice identifying whether an article is primary or a review. So I'm going to click on the Citation-Based Searching tab. There's a video here that you can watch if you aren't familiar with finding the full text of articles when you have just the citation. And there's also some information written out here about different tactics you can try to find that full text. Way at the bottom, we have a couple citations listed. So we're going to use these to practice finding the full text and analyzing the articles to see if they are actually presenting original research or primary research. So how would you go about finding the full text for these articles? Let's start with this first one. One recommended tactic is to search for the article title in the library's quick search. So basically, I'm going to highlight the title of the article, which we can see is in quotes here. The journal title, where the article is published, is in italics. And we want to pay attention to this journal name to make sure that when we search for the article, it's actually the correct resource that we find. So going back to the library homepage, going back to the tab I had open, and clicking the UNM Libraries link in the upper left to go back to the homepage. And here, in the quick search box, I'm just going to paste the title of that article. Since I'm accessing from off campus, I'm prompted to sign in using my NetID and password. It had it saved in the system, so it signed me in automatically. And here, I can see a couple of articles that came up. I'm going to go back to that page where I have the citation, and I just want to double check to make sure that this is the article that's coming up as the first result here in the database. So it's in the Journal of Wildlife Management, Volume 72, Issue number 2, published in 2008. Going back to my results list, I see Journal of Wildlife Management, V72, that's volume, and 2, that's number, published in 2008. So it looks like this is the same article. So I can either click this Access Online link here, or I can click the article title to see a little bit more information about it in our catalog. I can hit Description, which will bring open this drop-down menu showing you some associated subjects with the article. Also, the full abstract is listed here, in case that would be helpful. And then I want to pay attention to the availability and holdings information. So here you can see that there are a number of links that you can click to link to the full text version of this article. It can be a little confusing because sometimes the library has access to different journals and different articles through multiple databases. So sometimes it'll show you the date range that may be applicable to these different database links, and that's something you could use to make sure your article is going to be available through that link. And if one doesn't work, I encourage you to try others. Scrolling down further, I also want to point out that our database also indicates when we have the print version of a journal. So here we have the physical holdings location within the UNM campus libraries. It gives us the call number if we want to go and find it in the stacks. It tells us what library this is located in. It's in the Centennial Science and Engineering Library. And then it also gives the volume and date range. So it looks like we have this journal through 2010. And since this article was published in 2008, we would be able to find it in the physical stacks within the library as well as online. Of course, you can also use this request item link to request an article through interlibrary loan if we don't have it, as well as to request that the library scan an article that we only have in print. Okay, so going back up to a full text link, I'm going to click on the first one, and the article opens right up. And again, we want to look at this article to see if it might be a primary research article. So here we see information about the article. Scrolling down to the first page, we see all of the authors and their affiliation. We see a quick abstract here, some keywords. Then the first section doesn't have a title, It could be an introduction. And I want to point out this last sentence here, starting with, "We hypothesized the Mexican wolf diet would be mostly comprised of large ungulates and that coyote diet would be mostly comprised of smaller prey items." So the hypothesis is often something that we find in an introduction section of a primary research article. So this may indicate that this is a primary research article. Study area isn't really a section that we find in all primary research articles, but just because it isn't doesn't mean that this couldn't be a primary research article. There can often be additional sections outside of those core IMRD sections. Okay, going further, we see that we do have a methods section, and it looks like even in the first sentence, the authors are indicating that they collected new samples and then additional information about their analysis of those samples and how they were treated. So that should indicate that this was actually, or that this article is documenting an original experiment or study. And we see the next section is the results, which talks about the actual data generated through those study methods. We see a lot of graphs or tables. And then we have a discussion section, which starts off talking about their actual analysis, which would indicate an interpretation of their results. Scrolling further, we see some information that might be considered a conclusion. And then also this management implications section, which isn't a standard section, but this is talking a little bit about how the results of the study may affect population management in the real world. And then we have a really extensive reference list. So, seeing those core IMRD sections and seeing evidence that this article is documenting an original study, the results of that study, and an analysis of those results, does indicate that this is a primary research article. Okay, going back to our research guide, I want to look at the second citation here. And again, I'm going to search for it in the same way. We're going to look at the article title, Effects of Invasive Parasites on Bumblebee Declines, published in Conservation Biology from 2011. We'll go back to the UNM Library homepage, paste that article title into the quick search box, and search. And it looks like we see this article actually come up in the first two results. So again, this is kind of indicative of the fact that this article is accessible through a couple of different online access points. So that's why it appears twice. But it looks like both of these links would get us to that same original article. So since we already looked inside the other record, I'm just going to directly access online through the link here in the results. And it doesn't download the article directly for us, but we can hit this little PDF button over on the left. And from there, the article downloads. Okay, so again, we see the title, author and author affiliation information, an abstract, keywords, an alternate language abstract. And here we start with an introduction, which is one of those core IMRD sections. Give some context for this paper. Then we see a section called Pathogen Spillover, which could be more context. We don't know whether or not this is a core section. We see a table, which is typically something that in a primary research article we would see in the results section. Scrolling down further, we see another section called Evidence of Path over Spillover. I haven't seen a methods section yet. Potential effects of spillover. I see a lot of citations in here, so it looks like this article is referring back to a lot of work that's already been done, which could hint that it may be a review article. Here we have mitigation, and then we have acknowledgement section, followed by another really detailed reference list. So the only section that I saw that really conforms to those IMRD standard structures is the introduction section. And I don't see any evidence that an original experiment was conducted through the course of the study. It looks like this is just a review that's referring back to a lot of existing work and really contextualizing this information and synthesizing it into a current understanding generally of this topic in the field. So this is what I would call a review article. And as you may have noticed in the beginning, it actually says right here on the front page that this is a review. And that's something you won't always see, but is something that appears more often in pretty recent research articles. So hopefully that gives you a good understanding of kind of an approach to take when you're trying to figure out if your article is a primary research article. So I'm here on the Library Research Guide, and I'm going to go back to the About Primary Research tab. And from here, I wanted to point out some information here on the right-hand sidebar about why published primary research is important. So some of the core reasons why this information format is important is that the information is relatively current. The turnaround for articles published in journals does vary by the journal. Everyone has different workflows and publication schedules, but it can be as quick as maybe 3 months. Others may take a little bit longer, but regardless, typically journal articles are published much more quickly than something like a full book or any other kind of formal overview publication. Primary research articles, the work in those is also technically replicable. So there should be enough details within these published studies that if you had the equipment and the means, you could actually recreate that study and you should be able to get similar results. There is actually a lot of debate recently about replicability of many scientific studies. It turns out studies aren't often reproduced because it's difficult to get funding to conduct that type of research. And when they are reproduced, often the results aren't exactly the same. They're statistically different. So just something to keep in mind. But theoretically, you can recreate these experiments. These information resources also contain raw data. So you see the results of the experiments in that results section. Sometimes there's also an additional document in the supplementary materials section, which can be a different PDF or Excel document or some other type of data set format that you can download separately from the written article. In any case, this data, regardless of its form, should be presented objectively. There should not be an element of interpretation in the presentation of this raw data. But these articles do also show the logic associated with the interpretations that follow the presentation of the results. So authors typically develop conclusions and different analyses of what their data are saying, and we should be able to use those analyses in combination with the data, the results, to understand the logic that the authors are employing to make those conclusions. Okay, so now I'm going to go over to this Reading Primary Research Articles tab. And from here, we see a little bit more information presented about the type of information in each of those core IMRD sections. So basically, in a standard article, you'll have a title and an abstract. The abstract is generally a concise summary of the study. And that information can be used to really understand if you want to invest the time to read further into the article. The introduction section of a primary research article typically communicates the research context for that subject, including background knowledge, some existing research in that area, and it kind of sets the stage for your big question. It shows why that's important, and it can kind of put your hypotheses in context. The methods section then details the actual design of the study, including the research subjects or population studied. It talks about any equipment or processes used, as well as data collection and analysis methods. Then in the results section, you'll find a summary of the actual findings from the experiments. that were conducted in the methods section. So this should be where you find the actual data from the study. It should be presented objectively, again based on data, not interpreted. And this section often includes figures or tables, which are another way to analyze the data presented without being influenced by the words the author used to describe it. So you should be able to see it even more objectively by looking at those tables and figures. Then in the discussion section, the author should present an analysis and their own interpretation of that study data presented in the results section. So this should answer or address the hypothesis or hypotheses from the introduction, and it may also discuss any limitations of the study and potentially possibilities for additional research to be conducted. And after the discussion, there may be an acknowledgement section, but there will always be a references section or a bibliography showing all of the other studies that were cited or referred to through the course of this study, which can be a great place to go for additional information of related studies. So over on the right-hand side, you'll also notice that there are a number of questions that we recommend asking while you're reading. As a practice exercise, you may want to look to these questions and then go back to that primary research article we opened earlier, this comparison of Mexican wolf and coyote diets in Arizona and New Mexico, and ask yourself those questions as you read along. Finally, I want to suggest some strategies for reading primary research articles. Basically, there isn't one approach that's going to work for everyone, but generally, most people find that for comprehension, it's best not to read in a linear fashion. We recommend non-linear reading, which basically means these articles are written with specific types of information in each of the core structural elements. So a certain type of information is presented in the introduction and the methods, results, and discussion. But it's not necessarily written in a way that makes the most sense to read in order. It isn't like a novel where you would read from the first page to the last page. Depending on your interests in the study, what you're looking for, and depending on your stage as a researcher or scientist, it can make sense to read some parts out of order to kind of get a broader understanding of what the study found. There's also a link here in the research guide to an interesting article recently published in Science, news source in the sciences, and also a journal. And this shows you a lot of different approaches that different scientists at different points in their careers take to reading primary research articles. So it could be kind of interesting to see what other people do. But a couple of strategies that we recommend to early career researchers like yourselves are listed here in the library research guide. So this first one here recommends reading the title and abstract first to decide if you actually want to read the full article. And it then recommends skimming the full paper just to get an understanding of the structure, to make sure that it actually is a primary research article, maybe to give a quick look at the data presented in the different tables and figures, and any major results or findings that jump out at you. We then recommend starting with the introduction, which is kind of in a linear order. But this is a good place to start because it gives you context for why the authors conducted their study. It puts their question into a larger picture of what is going on in this field, what our current understanding of the subject is, and why this question is important. It can then help to jump all the way to the last section, the discussion and potentially conclusion, if your article includes a conclusion section. And you might want to read those next to get a summary of the actual research findings. As an early career researcher, it can be a lot more difficult to really understand what information is presented in the methods and results because some of the terminology might be a little bit confusing at this point, and it can be helpful to know what the authors found, which can influence your understanding of those more complicated technical parts of the articles. So next, we recommend looking at the figures, which are actually in the results section, but looking at these figures to understand the actual data gathered through the course of the study. So looking at the data, again, can potentially be helpful before you read the author's presentation of the data in text, just because it really is or should be truly objective. It's just showing numbers and facts of what was found. Next, we recommend reading the results to understand the data produced by the study. You might want to think about whether or not the data actually supports the author's conclusions. Think about if you would have made the same conclusions based on that data. And then finally, the last section we recommend, or the last core section we recommend reading, is the methods section. Typically, the methods section can be the most challenging because of the technical nature of all of this information. It talks about how the experiments were conducted. So if you weren't familiar with a lot of these methods, it may be a little bit confusing to get through. But this section can be very important if you're looking to replicate the experiment, because you can understand exactly what the authors did to get the results. After the methods section, it can always be a good idea to skim through the reference section to see if there are other articles that you might want to further explore for your research as well. And as always, regardless of what order you read these sections in, we definitely recommend rereading, which I know can be an additional time investment, but as a pretty early career researcher, it can be really helpful to read things twice, maybe even 3 or 4 times, to really get a deep sense of how the authors conducted their study, how they gathered their data, how they analyzed that, and what their conclusions really mean in that context. And then the alternate strategy we recommend is basically the same as the one above, except we recommend reading the discussion and conclusion section before the introduction. So basically the first core section, the first core IMRD section that we recommend is starting with that discussion, the last section. So we can understand exactly what the authors found, which can be helpful to develop an understanding early on in context of all of the other sections. So it can make reading about the process, data, and analysis a little bit easier to comprehend because we understand what they did conclude and find through the study. And then a few other tasks just to consider while you're reading. You're probably already doing this, but we always recommend to take notes, particularly to rephrase some core elements like the hypothesis, key concepts, key findings and conclusions, because doing that rephrasing of those concepts in your own words really reinforces your own understanding of what is being communicated. We also recommend keeping your purpose in mind. So think about why you're reading and what you're looking to find while you're putting time into reading the article to really understand what you need to get out of it as you're reading. We also recommend using a reference source, like a dictionary, encyclopedia, even something like Wikipedia can be great, just to define concepts that you don't understand, maybe particularly in the methods section, or just other jargon being used in the scientific discipline that you may not yet be familiar with. There's no shame in looking things up, and it's always easier to understand if you really get what the authors are saying. It may also be helpful to consider the audience of the article. Think about who the author is speaking to. Think about why the article is published and what prior knowledge might be assumed of the intended audience. So this can just help in terms of thinking about what the author may be assuming about your own knowledge that you don't necessarily have, because these articles are typically written for a professional audience doing research in that area who are pretty familiar with a lot of these concepts already. Reading is also social. So we recommend talking about research papers with your peers or instructors to help reinforce your understanding or answer questions. It can be helpful to try to explain an article, to just share your thoughts about it, or to compare your understandings with others. It can really help reinforce what you know by doing this type of communication about articles. And then again, we always recommend reading more than once because it takes time and practice to build an understanding as a new researcher. Okay. So going back to the homepage here, I just want to reiterate that if you have any questions at any time about reading scientific articles, the research process, conducting your own research, anything like that, feel free to contact me. I'm always happy to be a resource to students in biology. And in addition, if you are looking for any of the information on this Biology 203 research guide, you now know how to find it from the library homepage, but it's also embedded in the Learn platform. So you could find this in the Biology 203 area of Learn within the Ease Workshops folder.